Yo, what is up guys, Grim here, and in today's video we're going to be talking about the recent news that Beyond may be removed from PoE2. So in a recent interview on Bay Class with Chris Wilson, he alluded to the fact that some leagues may be retired in some way or form, and he specifically mentioned Beyond may be on the chopping block. Now, this video is intended to run through Beyond and perhaps discuss why this may not be a good idea, as I believe Beyond really does hold a very important place in a lot of players' heart, as well as a very important part of the endgame mapping system. So, of course, though, there are reasons that we should remove it, and perhaps this does need to be looked at as well. But we're going to discuss it, and hopefully we come to a conclusion by the end of the video. But of course, you can leave your comments down below. So let's get straight into it, and let's talk Beyond and whether or not it should be in PoE2. So let's get started. I think with Beyond, we need to start in early maps because that's where you first encounter it, both as a new player and an experienced player. You can roll Beyond on pretty much any map. It's not a rare modifier by any means, and it pretty much shows up pretty much as any other mod. Might be a little bit more on the rare side. Now, is this technically considered a league mechanic implementation? It doesn't have a chance to appear in maps randomly, so it's quite deterministic, and it only appears as a map modifier and a sextant modifier. So my first point here is that I don't really believe that Beyond has been implemented as a league mechanic. Other than the Zana map device, there's no real implementation of Beyond outside of map mod as well as sextant modifiers. So when you compare it to something like Incursion or when you compare it to something like Breach, it's not really ingrained in the game and it's not really bloating the game at all either. It's very much an opt-in or a random kind of occurrence that just happens on your maps which you have full control over re-rolling. Now, having said that though, if you do a Beyond map in the early stages of the game, I believe it is a completely awful experience. So let's go over why I say that. So first of all, I think it's quite a frustrating league mechanic when you don't know what's going on. Random monsters appear when you kill packs. These monsters are significantly stronger and more unpredictable than the monsters in the map, and they often have some pretty insane abilities and quite unfair abilities in my opinion, especially when you're not expecting them. Most of these mobs use Flicker Strike, they have chaos damage. A lot of the bosses have extremely unfair screen-wide abilities, and it is quite frustrating, especially even for me, when I'm starting off the league and my character isn't that powerful. So this is an important note. In addition to that, it doesn't drop a lot of loot early on. It's quite underwhelming indeed. You're looking at getting like maximum, like some rares and stuff like that. It doesn't do a lot at all for the loot multiplier of a map, compared to other leagues at least. So what are the key takeaway points here at the start? So it's a pretty frustrating experience at the start and it's not a very rewarding at that. However, you do have quite a lot of agency over whether it's going to be on your maps, and because of that, it's not really a fully implemented league. It's very much just a feature or a map modifier that you could get on a map. It's kind of like fire monsters, but instead of fire monsters, it's Beyond monsters. Having said that though, it does work functionally a little bit different, and it's probably similar to Hunted Traders in the fact that it's more kind of like crazy. So yeah, I would probably put it in the map modifier bucket, not the league bucket. So that's kind of my opinion there to start off with. So let's continue on. Let's talk about mid-game. So let's say, you're out of the white and yellow map progression and you're into the end game. So you're starting to do red maps, you're having to corrupt your maps, maybe getting started on your Awakener bonus in the current iteration of the game. Now, this is where I believe that some of the problems start to happen. You're really going to be up against it a lot of the times. If your build isn't insane and you're like a new player or anything like that, these portals start to become quite valuable, and some of these maps also start to become quite valuable, like 10 or 15 C a map, even like a few weeks in, so it can be quite risky if you start losing portals, and that's where some frustration can come from with Beyond, in my opinion. Secondly, you must corrupt your maps to get the Atlas bonus on some of these things. Now, these maps have a chance to corrupt into 8 modifier maps with completely random mods. So you could get Reflect, you could get Temporal Change, but you could also get Beyond. And that means you don't have control or agency over whether this modifier will show up, and it can lead to some extremely difficult maps, and in a lot of cases, very frustrating deaths, and sometimes even breaking maps just by one bad Beyond boss spawning in a really difficult spot. So I completely understand this, and it's happened to me as well, even as a more experienced player. Beyond is definitely something you look at and you're like, ooh, that could be pretty spooky if I get a bad, like, kind of like unlucky boss in some part of the map, especially if you're playing a squishier or under-geared character. So that's kind of the big downside when you're in red maps. So you don't really have control as much, really, because you're corrupting your maps to get progression, and these maps are worth more, and you're more likely to have a situation where you're going to run out of portals, which makes it a lot more deadly. Again, the loot is not going to be significant at all. Maybe you get a bit of map drops or something like that, but that's pretty much the maximum you're probably going to expect to get. Beyond really doesn't drop a lot of currency and stuff like that. That's just how it is. It doesn't appear to drop an insane amount of loot when you're kind of doing it in normal maps. So now we've kind of gone over the early and mid game of PoE, in my opinion. And it's a pretty underwhelming mechanic. It's not forced on you, it's not in maps all the time, it's not really random in maps, you have quite a lot of control over it outside of corruptions. But yeah, it's a pretty underwhelming one, and I expect most of the community to have that exact experience with it overall. And with that said, most of those people are probably going to agree that it is probably something that could be removed if we needed to. It doesn't really offer a lot, it just adds frustrating difficulty, and it doesn't, add too much to the game. Now let's get to the end part here. This is the part where I spend a lot of my time, and I feel like I have a bit of a unique opinion, which maybe a lot of people haven't got a chance to hear. So this is the late game. This is when you've got your full Awaken or bonus done. This is what you're seeing in the background here. This is the absolute pinnacle of mapping content. Beyond holds a very special place in this type of content. And for all intents and purposes, for a game like World of Warcraft, I would compare Beyond or Double Beyond endgame mapping to Mythic Raiding. That is the absolute endgame that you can do in Path of Exile. Double Beyond, massive, insane modifiers on a map. It is as difficult as you can make it, and removing Beyond takes out a lot of that fun. It completely declaws the experience, and it really would be a massive loss, in my opinion, to the game. Now let's break this down a little bit more, because there is actually quite a lot to consider here, and I'm going to go over it because it may still seem quite bad for a lot of people, because it does really have a lot of big problems with the game with the addition to Beyond. And let's get into what I mean by here. So first of all, I just want to say that Beyond, a lot of people, they feel like it's a difficulty increase on the low end. That's absolutely true. But on the absolute high end, when you're using Beyond and Double Beyond, which basically means that you get more and more of these monsters, it actually becomes an insane difficulty increase. It's absolutely mind-blowing how much harder it is. And it's so hard that I could actually tell you pretty much every single name of all the monsters. So you got Bameth, Haast, Zediosh, all of these guys. These guys, I know all their abilities off by heart, and if you get hit by any of them, you're pretty much dead in these endgame maps. Now, what do I mean, and what am I getting at here? What I'm getting at is, these guys are the endgame bosses of maps, really. They are the things that spice it up. They're the things that you're dodging. They're the kind of bullet hell kind of content that we've grown to love in PoE. Stuff like Bameth can be a bit frustrating, but when you see Bameth on the screen, you suddenly, you clench a little bit. It's very exciting. It really adds a lot of excitement to those maps. And now I've lost tons of maps to really insane Beyond. When I've Double Beyonded it, it's too much for my character to handle. And I lose, multiple exalts because I invested too much in the map. Now that's fine. I think it's fantastic. And that's really what I love about Path of Exile and the endgame mapping system. That can happen, that there's too much intensity in the map. And to lose that, which we absolutely would if we lost Beyond, would be a real shame in my opinion. Now, I've obviously gone over here, how important it is to endgame mapping and really how fun it is. But of course, there is the problem of how much loot it generates, how much mob density, experience and all that kind of stuff that it creates. So let's start with the elephant in the room, and that is Headhunter. So when you're adding beyond monsters to a map, depending on how much density and insanity is already in the map, it's going to make it like, almost exponentially more insane. That's kind of how it works. It's kind of like a multiplier on how much you've got in there, but it multiplies more the more there is. So it's kind of like almost, I would say exponential to some extent. Now, Headhunter completely abuses this because one of the main things spawned by Beyond are rares. Now, rare monsters give you Headhunter stacks, which increase the power of your character significantly. And you can sort of get to a point where you get so many Headhunter stacks that allows you to go much faster through the map, which allows you to accumulate those stacks faster and faster and faster. It's almost like a snowball effect, letting you do these maps, which should normally not be really possible by any means, and it makes it possible. So I would say Beyond is one of the reasons Headhunter is so powerful and allows you to really extract so much value out of these maps and do them so quickly. Most traditional characters wouldn't be able to do these maps really at all, and if they could, there would be no way they could do them at the pace that you can do them with Headhunter. So these two things kind of feed off each other, Headhunter and Beyond. They're kind of like part of the same problem. Next problem. They are an absolutely incredible, massive loot multiplier as well as density multiplier. So in the past, the loot hasn't been too much of a problem. In some leagues, we've seen it very heavily abused by a combination with Val wins to absolutely just dump massive amounts of divines and fusings into the economy. They obviously do drop a lot of loot by themselves, and they drop an absolutely insane amount of loot with Nemesis drops 3 additional currency loot modifier on the Sextants. So these are all things that are coming from Beyond, but what really has made it insane is the fact that you get additional monsters for your Delirium Orbs. This has really tipped Beyond over the edge, and it has made it an absolute mainstay in the endgame in terms of loot. And really, this does kind of dump a truckload of stuff into the economy every single time. It really is exacerbating the delirium problem, and it is the reason most currencies are massively devalued in the last 2 leagues. Really, that is a big issue. Additionally, they also drop a ton of uniques, and that is also contributing to the unique problem and why everything is so cheap. Now, this has a flow down effect and really kind of devalues everything that everyone has in the game, because a lot of players are pulling, hundreds of fusings, hundreds of alchemies out of these maps. Like in 15 minutes, you can get like 100 alchs, which is completely ridiculous. This kind of like does have knock-on effects for the trade experience. Again, as I was saying, it devalues the currency for everyone else. So instead of your alch being worth like, half a chaos, it's now worth a quarter, which definitely makes it much harder to accumulate currency as a newer player. And Beyond is contributing to this. So does it need to go? Potentially. It's a big part of why there is so much loot sloshing around in these endgame maps. Now, removal of Beyond isn't going to fix that, but it will turn it down. So yeah, obviously we've got a lot of points here. In the early game, it's not very good for players. Mid game, not very good for players. In the end game, it's an absolute incredible and fun experience. It's very, very fun, very, very rewarding. Like a massive fun multiplier, can't emphasize that enough, but it also contributes to the massive loot problem and sometimes performance problems of PoE. Many people can't even run these maps on their computer. It's just so intense. There's so many calculations happening with the damage, the Beyond portals, and all of that stuff like that. So at the end of the day, should Beyond stay for PoE2? So I'm not really sure what direction we're going with in PoE2, but it looks to be pretty much a completely different game. Where there's like a lot of emphasis on going slower, a lot of emphasis on visual clarity and stuff like that, it looks like, and a lot of emphasis on how it looks. Now, Beyond doesn't really fit that mold too much, but I do believe that it does have a place in PoE and it should stick around. It's not a traditional league mechanic and it's not implemented as such either. So I think that we should take it out of this early stages of the game. It has no place in white maps, and it almost doesn't have any place in red maps, in my opinion, because it hinders progression and can be quite frustrating. However, I do believe it has a place in the absolute end game of PoE. It really does make things a lot more fun, and it really does make things a lot more challenging. Without it, I believe that maps would be a lot more boring and they'd feel hollow for the absolute end game. So what I'm proposing is that you basically limit it to the absolute endgame. Make it a very expensive buy-in or something like that, or something that you have to craft, maybe keep it as a sextant modifier, as a map mod only on red maps, perhaps on T14 Plus or something along those lines, and I believe that would solve a lot of the problems people are having with Beyond. That way the people who it's intended for, or like it's grown to be intended for, which is the absolute end game players, they have access to it, but then it's also not, plaguing these newer players where it's a very bad experience for. So that's going to be my take on it. I'm kind of sad to see that it may go. I would be very, very sad indeed, but we got to make some sacrifices for PoE2, but I personally hope it sticks around, and until then, I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.